I know that Nin would have been extremely proud, obviously disappointed not to be here, but extremely proud of everyone who's contributed and said and played so beautifully today. When I phoned her, she would often answer, "Hello, Charles, I was just thinking about you." And for many years I used to think this was just a sort of well-meaning exaggeration, and it has to be said that exaggeration was something of which my father, who was in so many ways opposite from her, yet married for many years, often accused her. And he would say, "L'exagération consiste à amplifier et à garantir." This was part of his attempt, wholly unsuccessful I should say, to inject into her thought processes an element of what he considered to be logical reasoning. According to him, at any rate, when he first proposed to her, not long after they met in the Gods at the Brighton Dome Theatre, she said in reply to his proposal, "I don't know." And he replied, "What is it that you don't know?" And she said, "I don't know." I'm not sure whether to my father, a product of the French classical education system, this appeared as profoundly logical or simply deeply confused, but fortunately for me and my brothers, neither of them was deterred by this exchange. So returning to my mother's habitual telephone greeting to me, and probably having inherited some of my father's attitudes, I would point out in reply to her that it was improbable that the person being called, in this case her, would frequently happen to think of the person who happened to be about to call her up just moments before that person actually did so. And it is improbable unless, of course, you are willing to assume some relevant form of paranormal communication, something that my mother may well also have believed in. She certainly wouldn't have ruled it out. Informed, as you've heard, as she was in matters scientific, as I would also point out to her, perhaps not charitably from time to time, formed mainly by her education at the hands of the Catholic Sisters of the Order of the Sacred Heart Convent School in Hove. I may be being very unfair to that august establishment, and in fact one of Lynn's old school friends, who I'm really happy to say is here with us today, will be able to correct me later. But I was able to demonstrate with impeccable logic that Lynn could not have been thinking about me, but despite my logic, she was entirely unfazed. "Well, Charles, I was thinking." I realised that I was wrong, and that my mother was neither exaggerating nor, I'm afraid, disappointing one, gifted with supernormal powers. The explanation was that she was simply thinking about everybody she knew all the time. Her children, her family, her wider family, and her friends. And in some way, all of us and all of you were a revolving constellation, which she was able constantly to keep in her view. And all of us were, I think, very happy to be kept in that view, as today's gathering bears out. And I think it wasn't just because of her kindness and her open-heartedness, but also because of that great positivity, which I'm happy to say she maintained up to the very end. An attitude which I think was just more than simple encouragement, and underneath all of that kindness and all of that warmth, there was a great sense of self-discipline and resolve. Her daunting experience at the hands of the French minor aristocracy that Ada went to must have been a pretty formative experience in that regard, but I'm going to give you a few other instances. When COVID came and we were all locked down, I was obviously a bit concerned about how Linda on her own would manage without the constant procession of visitors to her, which was so much a part of her life. "Well," she said, "this is not so bad. When you were 5, I had meningitis. They thought I was going to die. Put me in an isolation room, and I had to lie on my back and not move a muscle for 3 weeks. You boys came to see me and looked through a little window. As I lay there, I couldn't even read or listen to a radio." Now, I've got no memory of this, but even if it's only half true, it shows a remarkable amount of willpower, and for a mother of young children, it must have been a desperate time. It was never mentioned at home and never used as an excuse, and that shows a wonderful lack of self-pity. It was famously difficult, in fact, to get Lynn to admit to any form of ill health, and one would bring up when she was coughing and referred to, "It's just a little croup," or "It's just my malaria." Some of you might know the comic Spike Milligan had put on his gravestone words, "I told you I was ill." But Lynn's would have been the absolute opposite. "I'm getting much better." Moving forward in 1989, we saw a picture of him, one of the last pictures, our much loved youngest brother Nicholas, who was then aged 19. In his first term at university, suffered an emphysema attack in his hall of residence, and my brother Richard and I arrived at University College Hospital to find him dead, and then had to phone our parents in the middle of the night. And obviously I don't know what conversations Robert and Lynn had between them, but I will never forget the extraordinary dignity and the composure and perspective that they brought to this situation. I'm sure with a view to helping all of us get through it, and I've often reflected on that in the last few weeks. When I started my own family, Lynn and I were sitting in my garden a few miles from here, a place that she's been very much part of, and out of nowhere she said, "I have to tell you, you have a sister." And she told me that before she met Robert, she had had a little girl, and as people did in those days, had given her up at birth for adoption through the Catholic Church. And she had, of course, no way of finding that little girl. But many years after that conversation, a letter arrived at my chambers in London, my professional chambers. "Dear Charles, you don't know me, but I believe I am your sister." As I later learned, Sophie had been able as a young woman to gain the confidence of her local priest, who from his own knowledge decided, very wisely I think, to tell her Lynn's maiden name and where she came from. I think Sophie was then able to use her ingenuity to comb through the registers and find out the marriage of Celia and Robert Béar. But by the time that happened, we already left Brighton for Stroud, and Sophie got on with her life. Many years later, having had her own children and knowing that her mother would also be getting on in years, I suppose, Sophie decided to have one last attempt. But by then, although this was already the era of the internet, Robert had died. Lynn had not only moved, but changed both her surname and her first name. An effort that could hardly have been better if it had come out of the Day of the Jackal. To make matters worse, and for reasons we probably shouldn't go into, both of her other remaining sons, apart from me, had found it expedient to change their surnames. The barristers, on the other hand, can't very easily change their names. In fact, they're very easy to find. We're always desperate for work. So Sophie sent me a letter. But having received it, I did have to decide what to do, because despite Lynn's earlier relation to me, I wasn't 100% sure what she would think and what she would want to do. I didn't want to put her in a difficult situation. And at that time, I was convalescing, and Lynn came to London to give me a good foot rub and probably some unwanted dietary advice. Lynn, if you are listening, can I just say cheese and salami are the cornerstone of a healthy diet. I told Lynn that I was doing which was not true, I told her that I was doing a fascinating case about a new adoption service that provided a means for adopted children and their birth parents to meet up, and she immediately said, "Oh, do tell me how it goes. I would love to meet my daughter." And so as Lynn left to go back to Stroud, I gave her an envelope, a blank envelope with Sophie's envelope inside it, and Lynn, I think, assumed it was some money for the journey, and opened it only when she was halfway back to Stroud on the train to read this letter. I often wonder what it must have been like for her to read that letter, but what always touched me was her immediate response, because Sophie had left her mobile number, and Lynn texted at once to say, "I am your mother." And within a short time, they decided to meet up and chose as their rendezvous St. Pancras Station, so that they could take the Eurostar to Paris for the weekend. It must have been easy, Sophie, for you and Lynn to recognise each other, since despite the absence of any contact, you both shared a taste for floaty, purpley, orangey, proving that nature can be stronger than nurture. But how courageous and open-hearted of my mother and Sophie and you, I think, to go down that path. And my last example is from Lynn's final days, and it was a privilege to be there with her in her home, where she very much wanted to be. And I want to pay tribute to three ladies, Goldie, Jo and Rose, who were her carers, and whose affection for my mother was genuine and reciprocated, and they contributed an enormous amount to the way in which Lynn passed on. She retained her positive spirit and her open mind until the very end, and less than 48 hours before she passed away, Richard and I were at her bedside. She was by that stage, of course, fairly weak, but still herself. And she said, "I want to write a book about dying. That's wonderful." And then she said, "I thought I had died twice during the night." And we said, "As I think you would, what was it like?" And she replied, "It was extraordinary." And then she closed her eyes and went to sleep. So